to get started. My name is Henry Hale. I'm Professor of Political Science and International Affairs here at GW and also Director of Petrock Program on Ukraine. And it is our distinct pleasure to welcome here Dr. Oxana Shevel, who is one of the leading experts on Ukrainian politics, but as well has authored one of the most influential books, I think, on citizenship and forms of identity generally in terms of theoretical perspective, also working on Russia and Ukraine. And she's here to talk about her new book with Maria Popova, Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories and Diverging States. So very highly recommended. I think it's a very important book, and I can't think of a more critical time to discuss these issues than today, when we need to make sure we're absolutely clear about kind of what's truth, what's not, and also just to understand the different ways in which events are interpreted, right, apart from the politics. And this book just gives a really, really interesting and solidly researched perspective on the origins of the conflict and how to understand what's going on today. So I'll just mention, Oksana is also the former president of the American Association for Ukrainian Studies, is the president-elect and current vice president of ACES, which is the Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies, and vice president of the Association for Nationalities. So as you can see, she's very busy, and you can imagine at this particular time how busy she must be in terms of just the demand for her expertise. So I want to give you special thanks for joining us today, finding the time to come talk. And we'll just mention, if there are any students, we will be raffling off a copy of the book for students. So there's, I think, Nini in back has some slips of paper you can enter your name on for a copy of the book afterwards, after the talk. So let me just turn things over to Oksana, who can start off by talking about the book for a bit, and then we'll have some time for discussion.
Thank you very much, Henry, for inviting me to speak to you all, and thank you all for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here again. As Henry said, our book is about the origins of the war. I want to start by just saying very briefly how Maria and I decided to do it. We started working on the book very shortly after the start of the full-scale invasion. And at the time, you know, as probably all of us were really shocked, of course, by the developments. I personally didn't think that Russia would go all the way to the full-scale invasion. But then, of course, very quickly, explanations begin to emerge as to why that happened. And the dominant one back then, or one of the dominant ones, and unfortunately still remains very influential now, was this realist paradigm, so the realist claim that really the war is over geopolitical wrangling between Russia and the West over Ukraine, and it's this NATO expansion, the sort of threat of NATO expansion and Russia's security fears and so forth that are primarily causes of this war. And we felt very strongly that that is not the case. Both Maria and I have worked extensively on both Ukraine and Russia on domestic politics. We are both comparativists. And we really saw the roots of this war as domestic, primarily, and this is why we decided to write this book. So the argument we advance in there, I'm going to walk through this argument, but essentially what we argue that since 1991, and in fact even since the late Soviet period, Russia and Ukraine first gradually, but later more extensively, began to diverge. And this divergence took a form of what we call escalatory cycle, meaning sort of the more Russia pushed to keep Ukraine in its fold, the more Ukraine resisted, and the more Ukraine resisted, the more Russia pushed. And this divergence unfolded, as we said, first gradually, but ultimately more sort of rapidly, and there are specific, what we call critical junctures, when this process is intensified. I'm going to go over those as well. Unfolded along these three dimensions, identity politics, regime type, and ultimately geopolitical orientation. So it's not that, you know, we do talk about foreign policy, that there is, you know, obviously substantial foreign policy divergence. We are not saying things like it's not important. But in the story we tell in this book, this foreign policy divergence follows rather than precedes the beginning of the war and the conflict in 2014 in particular. And really the root causes of this war are domestic. So I want to walk you through in the time that I have. I'm trying to stick to 40 minutes according to Nini's instructions. I talk fast. This is, I can tell you why. I blame the Soviet government. Ask me that later. You know, it hopefully will let me get through quite a bit. So let me start, you know, how, you know, to unpack this argument that we have, that it is really this divergence along these dimensions and that unfolds in this escalatory cycle. Before I do this, I want to mention that even though, you know, a lot of the book talks about kind of Russian imperial identity and its designs on Ukraine and Ukraine's pushback against it, it's not an argument sort of along the lines that Russia was always an empire and this is why. Like, our argument is really contingent. We point out to the times when things could have gone differently. Again, these critical junctures are very important, and it's really a combination of how identity and regime work together to produce the outcome that they did. So it is, you know, sort of Russian imperialism is definitely part of the story, but it is not kind of a simplistic argument that everything is explained by Russian, you know, ages-old imperial identity. So let me you know, unpack these things a little bit in the time that I have. So we start the analytical part of our argument in the late Soviet period, when we point out that if we look already in the late perestroika, essentially after the 1990 first competitive elections that were held in the late perestroika, in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian parliament, and kind of that broadly reflected societal tendencies, at least at the elite level, what scholars have called the grand bargain emerged. So what was the grand bargain? Grand bargain was essentially an informal alliance between, on the one hand, national Democrats, who have the center right of the political spectrum. This is Ruch, these are former dissidents, these are people who have fought and, you know, spent years in jail for Ukrainian independence. It was very important for them. But they themselves were a minority, so they didn't have, unlike in the Baltic states, they were not sort of large enough group to take power single-handedly in Ukraine. But what happens among the Ukrainian communists, there is essentially informal split within the Ukrainian Communist Party, and part of the communist elite, led, you know, by President Kravchuk, you know, to give one example from that period, also decides that independence is actually something that they would favor, for reasons that had less to do with ideology, more had to do with sort of power, you know, interests, wanting to stay in power, all these various things. So this grand bargain forms that we are interested in Ukrainian sovereignty, ultimately in a separate Ukrainian state. And in order to accomplish this, political, you know, this part of the political class engages in various types of identity building, because again, kind of this notion that if Ukraine is a separate state, there has to be a nation underlying it, there has to be history underlying this Ukrainian separateness and its distinctiveness. And this political class pursues a variety of nation-building policies, and again, they become, maybe we can say, more Ukrainian as time goes by, but already in 1989, there is a law setting Ukrainian language as a state language. That's, again, symbolic. It's not really so much about everybody switching to speak Ukrainian, but it's an important symbol of separate statehood. There is citizenship legislation that insists on Ukraine having only single citizenship, no dual citizenship with Russia, no kind of common CIS citizenship. Again, that was a state-building tool, right? And also historical memory. Ukraine begins to narrate its history, you know, as far as kind of official historiography, emphasizing its, again, distinctiveness, periods in history which were suppressed or, you know, unsafe to talk about during the Soviet period when Ukraine was struggling for its independence. Now, all of these things are not welcome in Russia. Already, and again, this is something historians have documented, if we use this famous phrase by Leonid Kravchuk, who was re-elected Ukraine's president in December 1991, he describes collapse of the Soviet Union as civilized divorce. To use the same sort of analogy on the Russian side, this was more kind of was understood as the opportunity to rewrite the vows. So yes, the Soviet Union was collapsing, like there was no saving it at the time, but this idea that Ukraine and Russia would part ways for good was not really something that the Russian elite was willing and kind of could wrap its mind around. So there was sort of understanding, and again, we rely on historians who studied that period, in particular Plokhy's book on that last months of the Soviet Union. Even liberal elite around Yeltsin is kind of thinking that this is not really for real. This separation is not really something that is going to last, and, you know, over time we are going to rewrite our vows. So we have again this push for multiple citizenships, dual citizenship with Russia, attempts to draw Ukraine closer into the CIS, kind of this future political integration was on the agenda. Now, in Russia itself, of course, in the early 1990s was a different period from late 1990s or Putin period now, but even then, this attempt at civic nation building does not go very far. In other words, this notion that Russia is really a legitimate state in the borders that exist, and that these are legitimate borders, we're not going to try to recreate an empire, instead we're going to build a civic nation within its borders. This project is relatively short-lived. Yeltsin, of course, is facing a lot of opposition from the so-called Red-Brown coalition, from the communists, from the nationalists who bemoan the fall of the Soviet Union. There is all this power struggle where this plays a role. And already by the mid-1990s, we begin to see, coming from Russian liberals, including Yeltsin, this sort of special interest, protection of Russian speakers, you know, integration, so forth. So one can say sort of, okay, so if there was this tendencies, you know, nationalistic or imperialist tendencies in Russia in the 1990s, why doesn't it, you know, invade Ukraine earlier? again, variety of reasons. I mean, the two that I'm going to just to mention here and that we also talk about in the book. I mean, in part because, Russian state was obviously at the time very weak. There was war in Chechnya. There were all these domestic problems. But also there was more pluralism in Russia. So there were voices that did, support kind of democratization, de-imperialization of Russia. And even among groups and forces that favored some sort of, rewriting of vows with Ukraine, there was at least disagreement about methods. So this sort of idea that we have to invade Ukraine was certainly not the majority view, and there wasn't one person making these decisions. So again, kind of it is this interaction between identity and regime type is very important. So having kind of like imperialist agenda is maybe necessary but not sufficient to have an outcome that we would have, of course, in 2014 and after of the full-scale invasion. So that we want to highlight that it's really this, we look at how identity and regime type interact. Now, just to kind of illustrate how Ukrainian society reacts, so the story we tell in the book is primarily an elite story. This is one of the criticisms that we had received, having presented this book elsewhere. I think it's a fair criticism. We sort of take it. We are not, we use opinion polls and things like that, but primarily kind of the story is driven by what happens at the elite level. But it is important, of course, how society responds. And I want to highlight that in Ukraine, through the 1990s and into 2000s, there have been shifts of the identities of society, right? So it's not this sort of blue and yellow. These are the results of 2004 elections. You'll be many familiar to you, this divided Ukraine kind of narrative. And yes, that was definitely part of it. But these lines on the map, what they show is how pro-Western political parties do on the party list vote and the candidates since early 1990s. And we can see that even, 1991 presidential election, Chernobyl, who was sort of more pro-Western, we can say, or pro, anti-Russian candidate than Kravchuk, wins just in the Galicia and the three regions, oblasts that were part of interim Poland, right? By 98, Ruch already expands into Volyn. Then we go to 2002, Yushchenko's our Ukraine, right? It's already past Kyiv and sort of moving in that direction. And of course, there is, people like Henry and others who studied public opinion in Ukraine. The story is much more nuanced, but sort of what we're saying that even though this kind of identity separation is maybe driven by the elite as far as legislation and so forth, the society kind of gradually is moving in that direction as opposed to moving towards Russia, right? And this is the process that is, was quite gradual through the 90s, but it is there. Now, we come to the what we call critical junction. The first critical junction in the book is 2004 Orange Revolution. I want to say a little bit like why we define it critical juncture, because this is the period when this divergence that we talk about accelerates. In other words, both on identity dimension and on the regime dimension, Russia and Ukraine become more different. But this is also the time period that had the outcome of Orange Revolution been different, it was not really predetermined. This divergence could have potentially been halted, so I'll talk about that as well. So this is, critical juncture, meaning that things develop a certain way, but they could have developed another way. So what happens, of course, a problem, all of you familiar what happened during the 2004 Orange Revolution. There were two candidates, Yushchenko and Yanukovych. Russia supported Yanukovych, wanted him to win. Yushchenko was considered pro-Western candidate. That was very closely fought election. Then there were electoral protests. Ultimately, Yushchenko comes to power. And once he comes to power, in Ukraine, we see both a leap in democratization, and we also see greater divergence on identity. On the democratization side, I just want to show you, like we can see, and that would be the opposite from what happens in Russia. Like Ukraine and Russia really begin to diverge noticeably on these various measures of identity, of democratic politics. These are different from BDEM, on civil society, on elections, on all of these things. So Ukraine becomes objectively more democratic. Not to say it's perfect democracy by any means. It was a very messy period, a lot of infighting, corruption, all of this. But still, there is, essentially democratization that takes place in Ukraine, and in Russia, the opposite tendency happens. So what we see instead in Russia, Putin, of course, interprets 2004 Orange Revolution not as domestic political process driven by objective realities in Ukraine, but as a form of Western meddling, something that was orchestrated, engineered by the West with the goal to weaken Russia. And he sort of like tries to bulletproof Russian society and the state against the Orange Revolution, against Colored Revolution, creation of various pro-state youth groups and things like this, kind of general autocratization. To this graph I just showed, this divergence is there. And then also on the identity dimension, Yushchenko comes to power and he continues, but now in a sort of much more, maybe we can say, kind of vigorous or activist way, this narration of Ukrainian history, highlighting its distinctiveness from Russia, highlighting the historical moments of sort of Russian subjugation and attempt to crush independent Ukrainian political idea, Most notable achievement of this time period, of course, is the official policy on the Holodomor, the killer famine of 1932-33. Legislation is adopted in Ukraine that defines Holodomor as genocide of the Ukrainian people. And also wanted to show you that by the end of the Yushchenko period, this is the first bar here, like 2010, the majority of the Ukrainian society begins to agree with this, right? So again, this policy was Yushchenko's policy, he, spearheaded it. But of course, the tragedy affected everybody in the society. There was this recuperation of memory, and this is one, example when again, kind of on identity, Ukraine diverges. In Russia, of course, there is a narrative in the Soviet period that there was no famine or it was not man-made, and like if we agree it was man-made, it was a common tragedy of the Soviet people, right? Again, kind of emphasizing commonality, that there was nothing special about Ukraine. Certainly there was, no genocide of Ukrainian people by the common Soviet government. And that's really different now, perception in Ukraine. Yushchenko tries to also push other things. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into it, but we do talk about it in the book. His attempt to reconceptualize and sort of reevaluate a history of the Second World War, in particular the nationalist fighters, that this attempt is not successful, then it would become successful after 2014. He attempts again to establish independent Ukrainian church, not aligned with Moscow, also something he wouldn't succeed doing, but again, something that would come up the Maidan. But there is this divergence, right? And Putin, so in Russia, on the other hand, we see greater imperialization of this period. This concept of the Ruski Mir, so-called Russian world, really gains prominence by the late 2000s. Ukraine is defined as belonging to the Ruski Mir, to this Russian world by right and by history, and even kind of by divine will, because this Holy Rus, sort of this religious undertone to this Ruski Mir concept is important. And there, the Holy Rus includes Russia and Ukraine and Belarus. So this again kind of, as Ukraine is becoming more distinct and emphasizing distinct identity, distinct history, in Russia we see the opposite, kind of claiming Ukraine as really by right belonging together with Russia. So again, this divergence accelerates. So I already showed those, so I'm going to skip with them. Let me talk about a little bit how this was the period, like why we define it as a counterfactual, because things could have gone quite differently in 2004. Those of you who may have followed events in Ukraine at the time might remember that Yushchenko was poisoned by dioxin. He almost died. So that he survived it and that he was able to continue to campaign and get elected was really not sort of guaranteed outcome. And we're thinking, right, it's sort of interesting to consider, it's always somehow generates live debate, what would have happened. We don't know for sure, but we can, it's not unreasonable to say that had he died, Yanukovych maybe would have won, because it was, very close to the fourth election. Timoshenko may have stepped in Yushchenko's shoes, but did she have the same support? Not really, right? And again, that's sort of, and had Yanukovych come to power already in 2004, he would have had more time, that's what we suggest in the book, to try to kind of make Ukraine more like Russia, with autocratization, with pursuing identity politics favored by Putin, which he would try to do when he comes to power in 2010, but this process could have started earlier. And then maybe this divergence would have been bridging. In other words, sort of Russian desire to dominate Ukraine would have become possible with Yanukovych's help, kind of, Belarusization of Ukraine, maybe. Not saying definitely would have happened, but that's a possibility. Now, another counterfactual for the same time period, what if in Russia political competition survived post-Yeltsin, right? Again, of course, sort of Putin comes to power, the first election is maybe somewhat competitive, but after that there hasn't been any competitive election. Opposition is getting systematically crushed and becomes more and more authoritarian as time goes by. But if it didn't happen, again, they would say sort of this full-scale invasion of Ukraine maybe wouldn't have been in the cards. Because again, for two reasons, at least, non-imperial voices were thinking, Nemtsov was murdered. What if he wasn't, right? Like he would have had in a more pluralistic way, ability to campaign, ability to have his views, and others like him heard. And again, even if there is multiplicity of sort of versions of imperial agenda, but there is at least disagreement on methods and all these voices are out in the parliament and there is a discussion, again, it sort of, we would argue, makes this outcome that we would see in 2014 and 2022 less likely. So this counterfactual basically shows how, either Ukraine could have become more like Russia, right? Or if political competition survives in Russia, again, they would have had potentially a different outcome. Now, sort of going forward, fast forwarding to 2010, so the orange period ends, Yanukovych returns to power, comes to power in 2010 in the clean election. But then he very quickly begins to both engage in autocratization in Ukraine and also engage in types of identity politics that Russia would like to see. So we have imprisonment of Timoshenko, rewriting of the constitution to increase presidential powers, subordination of the judiciary, And so again, sort of Ukraine is becoming more and more authoritarian, in that sense becoming less different from Russia. And also he pursues a variety of identity politics that Putin would have liked to see. He, for example, this new law is passed, elevating official status of Russian. He begins to talk about, again, famine as a common tragedy, kind of the whole sort of staying away from this. It was actually one of the first things. I remember sitting, just clicking through the presidential website to see what's going to be the first thing that changes after Yanukovych's inauguration. Holodomor went off the website, the first thing they did, right? But interestingly, like, he doesn't actually cancel the law. So again, sort of, he moves in the direction Russia wants, but maybe not quite as fast as he wants. Right? And then, in Russia, we have both greater autocratization at that period of time. So Putin really, this increased autocratic consolidation. And also creation of this Eurasian Economic Union as sort of counterbalance and an alternative to European Union is trying to drag Ukraine in it. And of course, once Yanukovych reneges on association agreement, this is when we would see Euromaidan protests start. I'll get to it in a second. But it's interesting also to consider, we briefly mentioned it in the book, that this Yanukovych's pursuing association agreement with the EU was kind of made sense from his political strategy, because the EU was never nearly as divisive in Ukraine as NATO was, for example. So in a way, various oligarchs who supported him, they trade with the EU, so they stand to benefit themselves. And as an electoral strategy with an eye towards next election, it's actually quite savvy strategy, because his eastern and southern electorate from eastern and southern Ukraine was not going to go anywhere. But had he delivered this association agreement with the EU, he could have, quite credibly got some votes from the center and the west of the country. So again, sort of the fact that he pursues it, even though he's, deferring to Russia on various other things, from identity to autocratization, Kharkiv Accords, the extension of Black Sea Fleet, all of these things, he continues with this association agreement. But of course, Russia would have none of it. And we all know that eventually Russia succeeds through, secret meetings, bribes, all of this. So Yanukovych announces at the 11th hour that Ukraine is actually not going to sign this association agreement with the EU, and this is when we have Euromaidan. So Euromaidan, we consider it yet another critical juncture in the story of divergence between Russia and Ukraine, because again, the outcome was not predetermined, and had the outcome been different, divergence would have potentially looked quite different as well. So Euromaidan, as most of you know, had quite regional base of support. It was supported by a lot of people, but also a lot of people who did not support it. And it is not inconceivable that Yanukovych could have prevailed either if he just waited the protesters out. I remember, you probably remember, Henry, we were in Ukraine when Euromaidan was ongoing. We had our Ponars meeting. I think we took a vote, like what's going to happen. And I was one of the 3 people who said Yanukovych is going to fall. But I actually was thinking exactly that he would overreach. And some other people thought civil society will mobilize. But anyway, so what's sort of the point there is that the outcome was not predetermined. And Luke and Way giving Yanukovych advice at the time, not him, but our group, he's like, Yanukovych, do nothing. And had he done nothing, quite possibly, right, the protests have gone a different way, or he also could have potentially succeeded prevailing by force. But of course, then what happens when he tries to apply force, this massive force, exactly 10 years to the day yesterday, was the height of the killing when dozens of people were shot in central Kyiv, this is when his own party cracks. So that's also important. So his sort of authoritarian machine, it held on to the last minute, but then eventually, in the face of this massive, unprecedented in Ukrainian political history by that time, use of force, his party machine cracks, and Yanukovych falls. Then, of course, new government that comes in is more pro-Western and so forth. But maybe it wouldn't have happened this way, right? Again, had he succeeded, that's why we say it's a counterfactual, and then he certainly would have ruled in very authoritarian methods that would have been the only way to sort of keep Ukraine subdued. And in return for Russian support, he would have been delivering yet more what Russia wanted in the sphere of identity politics in particular. And again, sort of this divergence could have been bridged at that time again, but that's not happened, right? So instead, Yanukovych falls, and we are now in this period preceding the 2022 invasion. That's when we see the escalatory cycle, what we call escalatory cycle, really peaking. And I want to talk a little bit sort of how it peaks during that time period. I think I'm doing a good time, yeah. One important consequence of Euromaidan was the changed electoral geography, because of course, as soon as Euromaidan succeeds and Yanukovych flees to Russia, Russia first annexes Crimea and then starts this separatist insurgency that they claim that they have no part on, but instigating it kind of across southeastern Ukraine, but eventually it would succeed only in Donbass. But what happens that already by the spring of 2004, given that Ukrainian government loses control of Crimea and of parts of Donbass, that is more or less 12% of the Ukrainian electorate. And this is also the most pro-Russian electorate. So this electorate no longer participates in the in elections that take place in Ukraine in 2014. And the result is very different composition of the Ukrainian parliament. So there is kind of this twofold change. On the one hand, like sort of pure mathematics, that's different, number of people are voting and the number of Russian people who vote in Ukrainian elections is now much less. And also we see changes, I'm going to illustrate some of those changes, in the attitudes and identities in the population, in the government-controlled rest of Ukraine. So this kind of dual process produces the parliament where pro-Russian political parties is very much weakened. And now the kind of agenda that, say, was very difficult to implement during Yushchenko presidency because there was a substantial sort of Russia-friendly or pro-Russian part of the political class represented in the parliament, is now able to be passed. So we now see, for example, the laws on decommunization that change kind of historical, remembrance of all sorts of things in the past, but especially events of the 20th century. We also see the formation of Orthodox Church independent from Russia, again, the kind of agenda that Yushchenko wanted to implement. We see new language legislation. So all of these things are now passing that before couldn't have been passed. And it's sort of ironic in a way. If I were Putin, I would kind of be scratching my head. It's like, is this really what I wanted? But that's the result, right? As a result of sort of Putin aggression, we end up with more anti-Russian Ukraine as far as attitudes across Ukraine. And specifically, this new electoral geography really produces quite different parliament, right? So Ukraine is also integrating economic, so its association agreement is signed. This conditionality begins to kick in, so we also see various democratic reforms. Maria, my co-author, is an expert on various judiciary reforms, on anti-corruption reforms, and she had written both, in our book and separately, about how important reforms that Ukraine had undertook since 2014. Again, not to sort of paint over the rosy picture that yes, there is still corruption, there are still problems with judiciary, but there is clearly, a push in the right direction, a move in the right direction. Civil society is very vigorously pushing for these reforms. So we see kind of both democratization and greater identity divergence coming on the part of Ukraine. Now, in Russia, we see the opposite on both of these dimensions. After the protests during 2002, the protests in Russia, when Putin, after Medvedev was a placeholder for a while, Putin returns to power. There are some street protests, but they're not really long enough, not strong enough, not powerful enough to change that. And that's kind of really sort of the last hooray for potential pluralization of Russia. So these protests are suppressed, then participants in the protests are suppressed. And of course, also with this annexation of Crimea, which is very popular in Russia, this kind of Krim Nash, sentiment. It's not that society necessarily is demanding more territorial annexation, but we argue that it creates permissive political environment. So in other words, people are enjoying this sort of great power status, like yes, we now have Crimea, so the idea that we would now get something else, again, it's not to say society demands it, but it's kind of not unreasonable on the Putin part to conclude, would he do this, there wouldn't be much societal opposition, and that's exactly what we would see later when this happens. And so this, again, this combination of authoritarian consolidation and kind of imperialization, that's when we see the narrative of the fascist junta in Kyiv, illegitimate Ukrainian government, something that we may get to into Q&A, because this whole narrative that Zelensky is illegitimate because his term expired last year. No, the Ukrainian government, as far as Putin was concerned, was illegitimate ever since Yanukovych was fled, because it's essentially because it became pro-Western government. So that's what's behind this narrative, but it is interesting to sort of see historically how this originates. Now, additionally, also the West reaction is also important because there isn't much of Western reaction. So this sort of permissive environment and the belief that really the West would be permissive and weak, the events that take place at the same time. So the sanctions after 2014 are not particularly strong. Europe remains dependent on Russian gas. Russian intervention in Syria doesn't really produce any kind of substantial sanctions. Russia engages in all sorts of subversive activity in Europe, from the poisoning of the Skripals, right, to munition explosions, killing of Chechen dissidents, and all of this. And there isn't sort of much as far as Western response. So again, kind of the calculus is that if there is some escalation coming from Russia, there wouldn't be much push from the West. That's not what happens in 2022, but that's part of that sort of calculus that is leads to the ultimately would factor into the invasion in 2022. The Zelensky's reforms, the anti-oligarchization reform, that in particular really reduce the power and the media reach of Russia-friendly oligarchs, especially Medvedchuk, it is again another element that sort of leads into this accumulation of tensions and the escalatory cycle that would then culminate in 2022 invasion. So in a way, these oligarchs and their media was one of the important channels of influence that Putin had in Ukraine, and with this de-oligarchization, sanctions against Medvedchuk, like that channel of influence is essentially slipping away. And last but not least, the Minsk peace process and Ukraine's unwillingness to agree to Russia-favored interpretation of the contested clauses in Minsk, most especially the special status. I do want to say a little bit, because we do call in the book this Minsk peace agreement the Trojan horse. And I want to explain what we mean, because it is often presented not by experts, but various commentators and talking heads, that there was this opportunity to solve the conflict, and Ukraine somehow reneged, and that's why there is a war. Well, the story is a little bit different, because yes, it's true, Zelensky comes to power on the general sort of message that he can meet Putin halfway, right, and they can have some agreement. And I think he probably was willing to try. But as soon as negotiations really begin in earnest, I think it's very clear that Zelensky realizes what really Putin demands would amount to Ukrainian loss of sovereignty, and the key stumbling block was the so-called special status that was provided. It was not defined what it means exactly. But the idea was that these Russia-controlled proxy regions would receive constitutionally enshrined special status in Ukraine. And in the course of negotiations, it became very clear that sort of the way Russia conceived of it was that it would be essentially veto power on the decisions of the central government. So that's what it was not about, language rights or any of these other things, which Ukraine was willing to concede, which were written in the accord as well. But it is this constitutional de facto veto by this small group of Russia-controlled separatists on the decisions, not just foreign policy, but also domestic politics of Ukrainian government, that Ukrainians drew the red line at. And that's essentially why these negotiations ultimately collapsed. Which again sort of goes to maybe incompatibility of really goals about. I think it's very important. So this Minsk and even some Western diplomats who were part of the negotiation process, they later acknowledged that this was really the stumbling block. So it was not an ethnic conflict. It was essentially a conflict over Ukrainian sovereignty, kind of masquerading as an ethnic conflict. And it becomes clear that Zelensky is not going to go for it. And that's when Putin essentially throws in the towel and goes in with the full-scale invasion in February 2022, because all these other levers of influence over Ukraine have failed. I just want to show you sort of these changes in the Ukrainian, again, happy to talk about it more in the Q&A, but changes in Ukrainian society that have taken, and again, how they follow this critical juncture in 2004, 2014. So this is a poll, Kyiv International Institute of Sociology have been doing this poll since actually going back to the early 90s. They ask people what is your primary identity, and people can choose variety, ethnic identities and regional identity and local and so forth. And this political identity, that I'm a citizen of Ukraine, really increases over time. So this sort of goes to the formation. Again, the real, the popular attitudes is much more complicated and nuanced story. Again, something I'm happy to talk about. But there is this trajectory of Ukrainian society kind of becoming more Ukrainian, committed to Ukrainian statehood, not thinking of itself as some sort of part of Russia. That's not something that Russia could really do much about, but that process is important. Another illustration of the same sort of identity change dynamic is on language. And here it's interesting because the top bar shows language people speak at home, and as you see, there isn't sort of much difference there. The chart ends in 2023. Since the invasion, that would change as well. Volodya Kulik, who I think was here, right, like not maybe that long ago, he studies this linguistic attitudes, linguistic changes, and he and others have pointed out how since the start of the full-scale invasion, we actually see also substantial uptick in people actually speaking Ukrainian. Again, part of it sort of as defiance, reclaiming identity, and so forth. But the bottom chart is interesting because it is asking people what is your native language, right? And that's really more of an identity marker. So somebody may not speak Ukrainian, in daily life, or speak Ukrainian and Russian and so forth, but there is clearly great identification with Ukrainian language, again, kind of highlighting that there is this change in the Ukrainian society. So it is becoming more Ukrainian, and that's not something, so this Russian project kind of has less and less support in that sense as well. Now, I do want to, before finishing, I want to address a little bit what essentially is a counter-argument or alternative argument to the one our book advances, which is essentially pointing to NATO expansion and sort of explaining Russian aggression as maybe unfortunate and still bad, but in some way justifiable reaction to the expansion of NATO. So this realist argument, kind of Meisharmian argument, which is very different from the argument that we advance in the book. And what we would say to this, and we do have a whole chapter on foreign policy in the book, so it's not that we sidestep it altogether, but we want to point out two things there. So first of all, if you look at the argument itself, it really has two versions. There are kind of basically two versions to the realist argument. One basically says that Russia perceives NATO expansion as a genuine security threat, so it is really fearful for its security coming from NATO. We think this argument is much, in a way, easier to debunk. That it was unconvincing before 2014-22, and it really falsified, we would argue, in the post-22 events. So most importantly, not only Ukraine had no realistic chance of joining NATO, so in a way no invasion was necessary to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO because there was no consensus, either within NATO or within Ukrainian society. So this sort of notion that somehow Ukrainian membership was imminent and Russia had something to do about it is completely just not true. Furthermore, when Russian full-scale invasion prompts other Russia's neighbors, in particular Finland, and also Sweden, to join NATO, if Russia was so fearful of NATO coming to its border, now we have NATO, within several, short miles to Russia's second largest city, St. Petersburg, Finland is right there. We would have, expected to see some reaction to this, but what happens instead, Russia not only really doesn't react to it much, it actually withdraws troops from the Russian-Finnish border and sends them to fight in the non-NATO member Ukraine. So if this is not kind of evidence to say that Russia really doesn't fear NATO, as in like that it's going to attack it, I think that's pretty, pretty clear in post-2022 developments. Now, the second version of this argument is more compelling in a way, right? It has more merit. Because it basically says, okay, so maybe Russia was not fearful of NATO attacking it, but it does not like the encroachment of NATO into its sphere of influence, so it is still sort of NATO is to blame, like if NATO was not encroaching, then, there wouldn't have been an invasion. What we would say to this, that this argument is kind of sort of NATO in this regard is neither necessary nor sufficient explanation for the invasion. And why that is the case? Because, as we show in the book, Russia's grievances and concerns about Ukraine go much further than NATO. They have beef with Ukraine, to use sort of non-political science term, that far extends Ukraine's geopolitical orientation. Just to give you some examples, for example, in 2008, when Lavrov was asked, what are the main problems in bilateral relations? And this is the time when Yushchenko is in office, there is Bucharest summit, there is all this discussion of NATO. He does not mention NATO. He says language and identity, right? Look, so if you are so concerned about NATO, he wouldn't even name it as among the main reasons. There are plenty of other evidence. Lushkov saying earlier that Ukraine needs to be invaded. Who cares if they're NATO? He literally says we have to invade them because of what's happening with Ukrainian and Russian language. So in other words, even if Ukraine is not in NATO, this demands on identity, on sort of compliance, on kind of being like Russia, not daring with identity politics has nothing to do with security, sort of hard security, but this is so central in Ukrainian-Russian relations and becomes more central as time goes by. So that's, we would say, makes NATO sort of neither necessary nor sufficient. So if Ukraine is not in NATO, there are still, and with sort of like the current moment now, right? Like the Istanbul agreement, which some say, oh, Ukraine missed on a chance, like that was, the time to sign a peace deal. Like, no, not only Russia was demanding veto on any kind of security guarantees to Ukraine, it introduces all of these demands about history, language, and so forth, which have nothing to do with hard security, but they have very much to do with this identity and re-imperialization. So again, not to say that Russia likes NATO, but NATO is neither necessary nor sufficient explanation for the invasion. This is what we would argue in our book. And I just want to end by illustrating this geopolitical divergence, because it also happens. This is sort of the third element, right? After we have identity divergence escalating over time in this kind of escalatory cycle manner, we have this regime divergence also growing over time, and identity and regime interact, especially during these critical junctures that I was mentioning. There is also geopolitical divergence, meaning Ukraine becomes more and more oriented to the West. But this divergence follows rather than precedes, in particular, Russian invasion of 2014, and also grows over time after this divergence, sort of following divergence on identity and political regime. So these two graphs illustrate this. I mean, we can see again the critical juncture of 2014 with the EU That's very clear, but it's even more clear with NATO, right? Because it's really this kind of overwhelming support for NATO comes after 2022, and for the first time, support for NATO begins to overtake the opposition to NATO is after 2014. So with that set of facts, I'll end. I think I'm a little under time. Actually, no, I'm actually...
It's perfect.
Almost, yeah. Perfect.
Perfect.
Okay, great.
All right,
So,
thank you. All right, no, that was great. Maybe I'll just ask a first question and then open it up to the floor. And I guess just question fairly straightforward, but maybe not simple, which is, what do you think are the implications of your argument for how the war might end?
Yeah, thank you, Henry. That's the question that I've been thinking coming here. And I'm like, I think okay, so let me ask you this. I think it's generally, in order to understand how the war might end, I think it's very important to understand why it began, right? And again, we would have very different implications, because if somebody believes this realist framework, that's really Russia, invaded because of NATO, and Ukraine is going to be in NATO, then really all is necessary is to say, like, okay, Ukraine is not going to be in NATO, and then like the conflict is over, right? Like, or it could be over. But that's not what we see happening. Again, I would highlight that already in Istanbul, this whole push for so-called denazification, which basically means any kind of identity politics that departs from Russia's narrative that Ukraine and Russia are the same people, and Ukraine and Russia by right belong together, right? And Ukraine belongs to Russia. They keep talking about it, right? So if you're really concerned, so I think, as far as the implication, that I think this would remain a roadblock, right? Now, if Russia is really unable to accept sovereign Ukraine, which I think is the case, because again, that was sort of, building up, but I think now, since the invasion is very clear, there is no accident that when Putin invades in February 2022, he goes straight for Kyiv, right? If you want to liberate people of Donbass or all of these things, like, why are you trying to go and decapitate Zelensky government? Why are they now insisting on having elections before the peace deal, right? Hoping that they're going to get rid of Zelensky, who proved to be uncooperative, and have somebody more cooperative to then sign whatever peace agreement that would give Russia what it wants, right? So I think this obstacle, that's the question, right? We would say implication from our book is that Russia does want much more than just Ukrainian geopolitical neutrality, military neutrality. It actually wants to have either a puppet state, or if not a puppet state, then have completely sort of subjugated and failed state. And this is why we have the kind of proposals that we have seen. Oops, that was the timer. That we have proposals that we have seen, that Russia would have a veto on security guarantees to Ukraine, right, that we saw in Istanbul, that it's going to dictate Ukrainian identity politics, that is going to try to now force whatever elections in some way, shape, or form that would bring, hopefully, some candidates that Russia would like, or would create such a disorder and collapse of the Ukrainian state that they can later go and pick up the pieces. So I think it means that any kind of quick settlement, be it 24 hours or 1 week or whatever current administration latest timeline may be, I think would be very, very hard. So it's not to say that the settlement is impossible, but I think these things would need to be addressed. And that for now, it looks like Russia and Ukraine are really far apart from agreeing, because neither Zelensky, nor Ukrainian political class, nor Ukrainian society wants to be subjugated and essentially capitulate to Russia. And Putin had given no indication that he's willing to accept truly sovereign Ukrainian state, even if the state is in reduced borders for who knows how long, right? And even if the state is not part of NATO. So I would say these are the implications.
All right, thank you. So let's open discussion up to the audience. Questions? Yes, please. And just ask you, identify yourself, please.
I go from Kazakhstan. My question is, what gives Holodomor that Putin and the Russian government, they have признали Holodomor, what does it give to Ukraine? Compensation or what?
I don't think, that's a good question, yeah. I think there are some, I would say maybe small minority in Ukraine that maybe somebody's thinking about, like, monetary compensation. But I think it's really more about kind of acknowledging at the level of identity that when Ukraine was in a state that was ruled from Moscow, this state committed genocide against our people, and therefore joint state is bad and separate state is good. I think it sort of ultimately comes to that, because again, if we think hypothetically, had Ukrainian Republic, People's Republic, which was crushed by the Bolsheviks by 2021, had it survived, probably would have been a total mess. But there wouldn't have been a Holodomor, because even the communist leadership of Ukrainian Republic was telling Stalin, like, our relatives are dying, and he's like, who cares, right? So, and the same logic applies to Russia, because if you recognize that Ukrainian people, and again, this is not really about ethnicity. Some say Holodomor is really about ethnicity. I think it's incorrect, because actually the law was changed in the draft that Yushchenko proposed to talk about Ukrainian ethnic group, but then it was changed to people, so sort of, residents of Ukraine. Of course, Ukrainians were the largest group, they were most of the peasants, but it is really kind of political notion in the law. So to your question, so I think for Ukraine, it kind of underscores the danger of being ruled from Moscow, and therefore the desirability of having your own state. And the same logic applies to Russia, because if you say, we say we belong together, Ukrainians really belong with Russians, together we accomplished great things, we had all of these, all the good things you had came from us, and then you can say in that common state, Ukrainians were genocided. Like that's sort of like a death blow to this whole concept of, common political home. And I think that's what's really added. So I think the sort of potential for financial compensation is really secondary, or even like, not, there are some people who have mentioned it here and there, but that's not what it is. I think it's really about kind of identity construction and historical narration and justification for sovereign state.
Thank
I think that's what it is, yeah. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Nadia Boreko from Ukraine. I'm a newcomer here at the Institute, and actually it's my first event attending, and thank you very much for your talk and also for a very important book. And I will ask you whether, I haven't read it yet, but I'm looking forward. So I'm very much interested whether you were looking at the role of so-called external actors, which contributed to this divergence, mainly the EU, because according to all the polls, we always had this dynamic. The younger, let's say, the respondents are, the more open they were to the idea of Europe as such, the more open they were to, the more supportive they were for the European integration. So somehow I was thinking that the EU, via the Eastern Neighborhood Policy and Eastern Partnership initiatives, really managed to enhance people-to-people contacts. And perhaps to which extent you were considering the role of the EU and the implications of the EU in Ukraine that were not that strong in Russia, whether they were, the impact of this factor was strong enough or it was not?
No, thank you. That's a great question. I mean, we do consider it, and in a way, it's sort of part of the story of regime divergence right there, right? Because of course, the EU, as you're saying, like, and there is political science literature about it, about the EU conditionality, right? That once a country has sort of the carrot of EU membership down the road, it promotes all sorts of domestic reforms. Broadly speaking, anything from minority rights to environmental regulations to political, liberties and so forth. And in Ukraine, up until association agreement was signed, and Ukraine was not formally, a member candidate for EU membership, it was sort of harder for the civil society, which was, and you said younger generation civil society, pushing for, democratization, liberalization. They couldn't really use this conditionality leverage, right? Because yes, if you're telling the political elite, you have to have, free judiciary and don't harass the media, and because that's the right thing to do, and if they say, well, we're going to harass them anyway, what's going to happen? No, there is, but once, this is why we see this accelerated democratization after 2014 by a variety of measures, exactly because this is when this EU conditionality begins to kick in a way that it kicked in Central Europe and the Baltic states earlier, right? Now, and of course, in Russia, that doesn't happen, but that's yet another kind of, because once you have growing autocratization, obviously there is no sort of, the EU is seen as the enemy, they're the ones instigating colored revolutions. All of these democracy promotion projects are very dangerous, and of course now they're all foreign agents and so forth, so that was another part of reform. So that it is part of our story, that it is one of the, I guess, mechanisms, we can say, of growing divergence on the regime type. Yeah, and I would mention about the book, I think there are a few copies out there that I can sell with an author discount for $15 a pop. So if anybody wants to buy a book, read it, нет хотят кассы, as they say, it's there, yeah. Thanks, guys, yeah.
Okay, thanks. Other questions? Yes.
Elena Wachan, Center for European Policy Analysis. Do you have any thoughts, why Putin can't consolidate regime in Russia, power? And in Ukraine, it did not happen. I mean, Kuchma tried hard, yes, and built this neo-patrimonial state. But after they went to different
Yeah. No, that's a good question. I mean, there is, you know, you may be familiar, our friend and colleague Luke and Wei wrote this book kind of explaining, essentially looking at, I think it's Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, and maybe is Belarus part of his book? I think so, right. Kind of seeing like why there is greater has been greater competitiveness, and the book was written, I think, just before the invasion for sure, I think just around the time of Euromaidan. So why basically Ukraine and Moldova are more competitive than Russia and Belarus? And he has this twofold explanation, which I think is valid, remains valid. Like one is sort of the extent to which political regime was able to consolidate economic power in particular, right? Like this great natural resources in Russia and sort of state control economy in Belarus that gives regime much more power over potential opposition and crush them and so forth. But another part of his explanation is divided identity. So in other words, that whoever, because both Ukraine and Moldova were more divided sort of on this east-west kind of, you know, pro-Russian, you know, pro-Europe, it gave whoever was in opposition some base of support, right? So in other words, if say you have whichever president came to power and they may be like more pro-Russian or more pro-European, they're still going to face opposition in a way that in Russia and Belarus they didn't, because there wasn't that divide, or as he called it, national identity, like what did he call it, anti-incumbent national identity, here's the term, right? So, but that's kind of the story. I think it works well until, I mean, reasonably well until 2014. I think, and it does explain, I think, to a large extent, why in Russia Putin was able, or more successful, certainly, than say either, you know, Kravchuk and Kuchma. None of them were great, even Yushchenko, right? Like, I mean, you don't have to have necessarily a great Democrat in office, but they are facing these obstacles in Ukraine that they didn't face in Russia. So that's kind of what he says. But I would add to it, I guess, two things. So first of all, back to the previous question, I think after 2004, and especially now when Ukraine is formally candidate for European Union membership, like this conditionality becomes very important source, right? So Ukraine in a way doesn't have that divided identity anymore. I mean, not to say that there aren't regional divisions, there still are, but they're sort of less than they were before the invasion, right? So if you sort of take Luke and Way's argument, you'll say, well, like, shouldn't it now potentially become more authoritarian because this factor that worked for diversity is no longer there? It's true, but, you know, there is now, so yes, there is more divided identity, but it's not sort of authoritarian identity. That's another kind of consequence of Russian invasion. And additionally, the EU mechanism is very important, and that's really is there after 2014 in a way that it wasn't there before. So that's...
Great, thanks, please.
Michael Shaw, I'm with The Insider. How did the Kremlin regime actually prepare its own population for this invasion? Because on the morning of February 24th, there seemed to be a lot of very surprised people in Russia, including pretty high-level figures in the Russian government.
Yeah.
So I mean, if we went back to early February 2022, and you turned on Первый канал, like, what would you be seeing? How did the regime prepare its own population for this?
I don't think, I mean, again, I'm not obviously in any way regime insider there, but I don't think they felt the need to prepare, right? That's another thing, because as I said, that what we point out in the book, that after annexation of Crimea and this whole sort of Krim-Nash phenomena, when it is broadly popular, it is well received, you know, this narrative that Russia is a great power, it's reclaiming what is theirs by right, it's like it resonates with the people, right? And any kind of opposition, that there was some opposition, some protests and so forth, by that point the opposition is really suppressed. So if I were Putin sort of thinking, doing this, like, do I really have the need to prepare, right? The population they're counting on is going to be largely, you know, they have not asked for it necessarily, but like they're not expecting some sort of large backlash, and whatever protests may arise by now really, they sort of partly destroyed, suppressed, and so forth opposition, they believe they can deal with it, and that's exactly what happens. So this is actually interesting. That makes me think of this argument, which in some way also may be a counter-argument to what we make in the book, that Putin, you know, invaded Ukraine and sort of was so concerned about Ukraine because it created a precedent, right? It was a dangerous example if Ukraine is more democratic, and you know, and that would give some sort of, you know, ideas to Russian society that they might try to do that, and that's why sort of it's not really the identity, it's kind of this Ukraine becoming more democratic. I know it's not directly to your question, but I want to just mention because I think it is partly relevant. What we would say that by the time the invasion takes place, this is not really a danger for Russia. This notion that there is going to be some sort of democratic uprising, like they have taken care of it already. In 2004, yes, like that was potentially still reasonable danger. But so again, coming back to your question, I think by the time they launched full-scale invasion in February, it wasn't just the society that wasn't informed. Like as you said, some of the elites, right? Like was it Narishkin who was like didn't know what was going on? One man, like a very small group of insiders, made this decision. And I think the reasoning was, which is not unreasonable given what we saw transpire in Russia in the previous years, that the society for the most part will acquiesce to this and probably even like celebrate it. There already been this whole narrative that there is Nazi junta in Kyiv, that we are going to free Russian speakers to protect them from genocide, quote unquote, in Donbass. And we see this evidence that, when people who had relatives in Russia, they called them and said, like, we are under the bombs, and they're like, no, we are coming to liberate you. Like, this is not happening, right? So I think this type of brainwashing and propaganda that they had for years until then, probably the calculus was that most of the society is going to be either okay with it or in support. And then whatever opposition might arise and protests and whatever, by that point in time, the state is so much in control that they could just crush it, and they did. So that's kind of, I would say, was likely happened. But maybe historians, once they get the minutes of whatever was happening on the day before, will tell us the story.
Okay, great. Yes, please.
Pavlo Smetsnyuk, I'm a Petrarch fellow here. I agree with your overall argument that the war is about Russia's attempt to keep Ukraine and not allow it to be sovereign. And I work on religion, and I think Russia's interest toward Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine is another illustration of this. It's about identity, culture. But I have a question about EU. Russia was very critical of Ukrainian membership in NATO, but wasn't as much critical of Ukrainian membership in European Union. That's true that they pressured Yanukovych not to sign the association agreement, and yet vocally they have been almost open to Ukraine joining the European Union. And I think even recently Peskov said that, Ukraine can join if they want. Why is that? How do you explain this? Because from my understanding, being an EU member means being a democratic state, sovereign state, somehow part of European security structure. Mm-hmm. How do you explain this?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. We were just talking with Maria about it recently, since this is Peskov or Lavrov, whichever one of them said it a couple of days ago, right? I would say two things to this. So first of all, the fact that they actually bent over backwards and went to a great extent in 2013 to prevent Yanukovych from signing the agreement is significant, because it's one thing to say you can join, but when push came to shove, they shelled whatever billions of dollars to bribe Yanukovych and started trade war, and NATO was nowhere near the agenda, right? So in that sense, I would say there are some reasons to suspect that whatever they say about you being okay with it may be disingenuous, right? Another thing I would say, that joining the EU is kind of extensive process, right? It's not that you join the EU one day to the next. There are all of these chapters that need to be opened, all these negotiations. In other words, there are plenty of opportunities to disrupt and derail this process, right? And maybe that's currently now is the calculus. Because if they say, well, okay, Ukraine can join the EU, but if Ukraine doesn't have any security guarantees, if it is sort of collapsing domestically, economically, if it is torn apart politically, right, if there isn't fighting, joining the EU sort of becomes impossible. Right, and maybe that's why there is now some lip service being paid to the EU, because they don't really think it's realistically going to happen, right? So that's what I would say. But I think the fact that they went to such a great length to prevent Yanukovych from signing not even the membership, the association agreement, I think that's significant. So, we'll see who's right. Maybe Lavrov is not lying, and then I'm going to eat my words. But I think he is.
Never did.
Yeah.
Okay, we have time, I think, for one last quick question. Yes.
Olga Shemyakin, I'm Georgia Tech and here Department of State, as a fellow. And my question is, I actually liked your counterfactual presentation, but and you gave Nemtsov death as an example that may have derailed it the other way, but. Does it mean that there was no critical momentum, not enough, obviously there was no critical momentum, but there was no other opposition at the time that was sizable enough? Because there is a research on assassinations, and that tells that if you have sizable kind of force behind it, the movement continues.
Yeah.
Kind of. Mm-hmm.
No, I think that's true. I think, partly I mean, obviously Nemtsov as a personality, you know, this kind of high-profile personalities, the importantest personalities. So he was, you know, an important voice for democracy, anti-imperialism, all of these things. So kind of him being assassinated is consequential. But you are right, that if there was some sort of broader opposition movement or political parties, or like somebody else could step in that role. But that's why we have, you know, it just wasn't. I mean, even if we look at the protests, you know, as brave as these people were who came to protest and so on, well, it was not large enough, it was not long enough, it was not strong enough, and ultimately it gets crushed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is the process that begins already as soon as Putin comes to power. And this is why I think this argument that there was some sort of fear of some kind of like democratization in Russia that would threaten Putin regime decreases over time, right? It is really a fear and the possibility, if we could talk counterfactual, that maybe there could have been some democratization had this protest been larger and, you know, different outcome in 2012 elections. But as time goes by the time we are in 2014, by the time we're in 2022, I mean, the notion that Putin would be dislodged by some sort of popular anti-regime mobilization just seems fanciful, it's just not there. So, yeah, so it's maybe not very satisfying question, but I think, I mean, answer, but I think both Nemtsov personally, like, just because personalities, I think, are important in politics, but I agree if you're saying that there wasn't kind of this broader social, political opposition type movement in Russia, like, yeah, I think that's true.
Okay, just one last item. So if there are any students here who have not put their name in the hat for a copy of the book, please do so with Nini in the corner. And then we'll draw it right after the event. But please join me in thanking Dr. Shevel for his